She said it was against the rules. I said, then let's break them together. And just like that, everything changed. The late afternoon sun had already begun to soften, casting long, honeyed streaks across the empty lecture hall. I lingered behind, pretending to tie my shoelaces, but really, I was watching her. She moved with quiet precision, filing papers, adjusting a stack of books, the kind of movements that seemed effortless yet carefully deliberate. Every gesture spoke of experience, a confidence earned over decades, a calm that came with knowing exactly who you were and the rules you lived by. I could feel the pull of the unspoken. She glanced up, eyes meeting mine for a brief heartbeat, and offered a small, professional smile, one that hinted at recognition, but maintained that careful distance between us. There was warmth there, yes, but also a line drawn, faint yet firm. I wondered if she knew how often I studied those lines, not to cross them, but simply to understand their shape. I stepped forward to collect my notebook, the leather cover smooth under my fingertips, my heart a quiet drum against my ribs. She handed it to me with the same measured grace she had in every movement, and for a single instant, our hands brushed. Not a lingering touch, nothing forward, but just enough to feel the warmth of her skin, a subtle reminder that there was a living presence there, tangible and alive, that existed beyond the rigid confines of rules and roles. My chest tightened, awareness sharpening with the smallest brush of knuckles, the tiniest spark in a quiet room. There was the faint scent of her perfume, something soft, almost like vanilla dusted with a whisper of cedar. It wasn't overpowering, it was the kind of aroma that lingered in the memory rather than the air. I noticed the way her sleeves fell around her wrists, the slight curve of her fingers as she adjusted a misplaced paper, the steady rhythm of her breathing that seemed calm on the surface but carried a weight beneath. I reminded myself she was my teacher, that every inch of closeness had boundaries. And yet, there was something in the way she let her attention linger on small details, the way she adjusted a book's spine, how she paused to catch a stray sunbeam on the desk, that made the rules feel both real and fragile. I left that day with my notebook clutched to my chest, and a quiet thought echoing behind my teeth. She told me once that certain lines exist for a reason. I didn't know then that I would study those lines like a map, tracing every edge, learning where warmth could exist without crossing into danger. The hall was empty, but the memory of her presence stayed behind, a soft, insistent pulse I could carry with me, a reminder that slow, careful observation might be the start of something neither of us had expected. The campus felt different in the late evening, quieter than the day's usual rush, almost as if it were holding its breath. I followed the familiar path to the seminar room, the one she taught for a small elective course, a class barely half full but full of curiosity, the kind that mirrored my own. After the students left, she remained, leaning against her desk as if waiting for the world to catch up. We started with books, naturally. A poem she recommended months ago had lodged itself in my mind, and tonight I brought it up again. She smiled, a slow, knowing smile that reached her eyes before it reached her lips, and for a moment, the professional wall between us seemed thinner, like a gauzy curtain fluttering in a gentle breeze. Our conversation moved from the syllabus to the spaces in between, the kind of personal spaces one rarely admits even to themselves. She spoke of her past quietly, almost shyly, about a divorce that had left subtle, invisible lines along her heart. She described the afternoons she spent drinking tea alone, the ache of evenings spent in silence. I listened, noting the way her fingers traced the edge of a notebook, the soft exhale she made whenever she mentioned a painful memory. I admitted my own uncertainties, the aimlessness of my recent months, the weight of choices I hadn't yet made. She tilted her head, just slightly, letting me feel the subtle motion of her hair brushing her cheek as she listened. There was no judgment, only presence. I realized then that this was rare, someone fully attentive, fully aware, yet never overbearing. At some point, our hands brushed again. I didn't pull away, and neither did she. It was a fleeting touch, a gesture so small it could have been accidental, yet it carried warmth, a reassurance that I could be close without fear. The simple motion lingered in memory, the soft friction of her skin against mine, the faint pulse at her wrist beneath her sleeve, like a quiet heartbeat speaking in code. The campus lights outside dimmed as the conversation stretched, the distant hum of traffic serving as a soft soundtrack. In that shared quiet, I felt a kind of understanding forming, fragile but unspoken. We weren't breaking rules yet, not explicitly, but the distance between us seemed to shrink imperceptibly, measured in pauses, in glances, in the slight inclination of her shoulder when she laughed at my clumsy jokes. Walking back across the courtyard, I carried more than my notebook. I carried the echo of her voice, the warmth of that small, shared moment of contact, and a quiet realization: the lessons outside the syllabus were the ones that mattered most, the ones that traced the edges of our hearts, slowly drawing them closer without either of us fully noticing. She taught me the name of a poem, I taught myself how to listen for what she didn't say. The next week felt heavier, though nothing in the air had changed. The campus was the same as always, the library hum of students, the faint smell of coffee drifting from the cafe across the street, yet there was a quiet tension threading through my steps. I knew what was coming before I even saw the email in my inbox, a polite but firm reminder from the administration about professional boundaries. I met her after class in the same quiet corridor where the late sunlight spilled in through tall windows. She was standing by the lockers, her posture upright but slightly tense. The shadow of the email had already crossed her features. "Rules exist for a reason," she said softly, her voice steady but edged with a quiet weight. I could see the careful control in her gestures, the way she tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear with deliberate precision. She was holding herself together, yet every movement revealed the tension she carried beneath her calm exterior. I felt a jolt of frustration, though it was mingled with admiration. Admiration for the way she upheld her integrity, and frustration for the invisible barrier it placed between us. My gaze fell on her hands as she rested them on the stack of papers before her. The fingertips splayed flat against the surface, a visual metaphor for restraint, strong yet delicate, poised yet tethered. I wanted to reach out, to close that distance, but I stopped myself, aware of every rule she had ever reminded me of. There was a brief silence, filled only by the distant echo of footsteps along the corridor. I could feel the quiet gravity of the moment pressing against my chest. For a second, it felt like we were the only two people in the world, two figures suspended between desire and duty, awareness and restraint. My heart thudded in my ears, a muted drum that neither of us dared acknowledge aloud. "I understand," I murmured, my voice low, careful. It wasn't a surrender, but a recognition. A recognition that the boundaries weren't arbitrary, they were real, and they mattered to her, to both of us. She nodded, her eyes softening ever so slightly, just enough for me to glimpse the vulnerability beneath the confident exterior. As I walked away that evening, the corridors seemed colder, the fluorescent lights harsher, yet the memory of her presence lingered like a quiet warmth behind my ribs. I realized then that the rules, spoken aloud, were no longer abstract. They were walls I would study, edges I would respect, even as I felt the magnetic pull of the space between them. Rain had started to fall in the quiet of the evening, soft at first, then heavier, drumming on the pavement and washing the campus in a silvery blur. I found myself caught under the covered portico near the seminar hall, hoping the storm would pass. And there she was, waiting, the edges of her hair damp, strands clinging slightly to her neck. I felt my chest tighten, a quiet recognition that the world had contracted to just the two of us. We shared a thermos of tea, steam curling between us like the beginning of some secret ritual. The campus beyond the roofed walkway was washed in a blur of water and neon reflections. I handed her the cup first, careful of the wetness on the rim. Our fingers brushed, again, that brief spark, a friction that lingered longer in memory than it did in the moment. I noticed her pulse at the wrist, soft and steady beneath her sleeve, and the simple act of being close felt charged, yet entirely safe. She laughed at some small observation I made, the kind of laugh that makes the sound echo in the chest. Her eyes softened, and I felt the quiet invitation there, the unspoken permission to exist near her, to be seen without overstepping. Slowly, tentatively, I reached for her hand as she stepped onto a slick portion of the curb, offering stability. Her hand accepted, neither flinching nor pressing too hard, the motion deliberate and unhurried. The warmth of her skin seeped into mine, a grounding presence, a reminder that intimacy could be measured and meaningful, not reckless. Around us, the world was a wash of rain, the sound of droplets striking leaves and asphalt a soft, rhythmic accompaniment to our quiet conversation. She spoke of a memory, a fleeting regret, a small hope tucked in the corners of her mind. I listened, leaning in slightly to hear better, aware that proximity carried a weight beyond words. The small closeness, shoulder to shoulder, hands briefly touching, was a dance of trust and consent. I realized then that the most important lines between us weren't drawn by policy or expectation, they were drawn by awareness, by care, by the choice to respect the other even while closing the distance. Each gesture, each tiny shared movement, was a lesson in patience, a study in how desire could exist quietly, restrained yet alive. Key line, narration. My palm settled at the small of her hand to help her balance, the skin there was warm and real, and the soft hitch in her breath felt like permission, not surrender. The rain fell steadily, and for that brief stretch of time, nothing else existed, just the two of us, suspended in the careful warmth of proximity, learning the quiet language of trust and slow, deliberate affection. The corridors of the campus felt colder that week, though the weather hadn't changed. Rumors had begun to circulate, whispers caught in hallways, murmurs in the staff lounge. Someone had seen us lingering too long after class, someone had misread the quiet familiarity between us, and suddenly the world had shifted. The walls, once just neutral boundaries, now seemed like they were closing in, each one pressing on the delicate space we had cultivated. She walked beside me, her steps measured, her coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders as if to hold herself together against more than just the autumn chill. Her eyes betrayed nothing, at least not on the surface, but I could see it, the weight of responsibility pressing on her like an invisible hand. A meeting had been called. Questions would be asked. Policies would be repeated. And somewhere in the quiet between the syllables of each rule was the understanding that our closeness was being examined, judged, misread. I could feel my own pulse quicken, not from fear, but from the urgency of wanting to protect her, to stand beside her, to let her know she was not alone. We walked in silence for a moment, the echo of our shoes on the tile loud in contrast to the muted anxiety thrumming between us. Then she repeated the words that had always been an anchor and a barrier, "This is against the rules." The sentence hit me with the weight of reality, but it also sparked something I couldn't ignore. It wasn't bravado that made the words leave my mouth, it was honesty, a willingness to accept consequences alongside her. Then let's break them together. She stopped, eyes widening slightly, a mixture of surprise and something deeper, the briefest flicker of hope or fear, I couldn't tell which. I stepped closer, careful, deliberate, and reached out to straighten the collar at the back of her coat. My hand lingered briefly on her shoulder blade, not pressing, not claiming, just anchoring, a silent promise, a subtle reassurance. The warmth of her skin under my fingers was grounding, a reminder that the choice to be close could exist without haste or recklessness. The corridor felt suspended in that moment, the hum of the fluorescent lights above blending with the distant murmur of voices beyond the doors. I saw the struggle in her eyes, the battle between duty and desire, between the rules she had always honored and the quiet truth we had built together. For once, there was no pretense, no hesitation. It wasn't about rebellion for its own sake. It was about honesty, about choosing to stand together even when the world demanded restraint. And in that choice, the quiet tension between us transformed into something alive, real, and undeniably ours. The days that followed were heavy with quiet reckoning. The world we had momentarily shared under the soft glow of late evenings now demanded careful navigation. She had called a meeting with the administration, her voice steady but measured, her words chosen to honor both truth and responsibility. I stayed nearby, not as a student or subordinate, but as a witness, a companion, someone willing to shoulder the consequences alongside her. Her courage struck me anew each time I saw it. She listened patiently, answered questions with clarity, and maintained the grace that had always drawn me to her. And yet, behind the professional facade, there were flickers of tension, a slight crease in her brow, the way she pressed her lips together when a question hit too close to her heart. I noticed everything, the small details, the rhythm of her breathing, the subtle tremor in her hands as she signed forms, the quiet sighs she tried to disguise. Together, we crafted a plan, a route that allowed her to preserve both her integrity and our connection. Perhaps it was a sabbatical, a temporary leave, a step back from the pressures that threatened to turn our closeness into scandal. The specifics didn't matter as much as the principle. We were choosing honesty over avoidance, responsibility over impulse. And through it all, I was there, quietly, offering steady support. There were moments of tenderness, small and deliberate, that reminded us why this struggle was worth enduring. Sitting on a windowsill in her office, a blanket draped over our shoulders, our arms brushed. I leaned my head lightly against hers, feeling the steady exhale of her breath, a rhythm that grounded me. Her hand found mine, fingers interlacing in a way that spoke of trust, reassurance, and a quiet triumph over the tension that had threatened to pull us apart. The world outside continued in its relentless pace, indifferent to the battles we faced. And yet, within the carefully drawn lines of our shared moments, there was a freedom, the freedom to be fully present, to choose one another with eyes wide open, knowing the cost but embracing it anyway. Each gesture, each glance, each deliberate closeness became a language of resilience, of patient affection, of love tempered by reality. Key line, narration: we didn't run. We rerouted. Sacrifice isn't always loss, sometimes it's the price of loving someone in a way that keeps them safe. By the end of those days, the tension began to settle into a quiet, steady warmth. We had faced the consequences, acknowledged the risks, and still, somehow, preserved the fragile, precious bond that had grown between us. In that, there was both victory and relief, the kind that comes not from defiance, but from the courage to act with honesty, care, and unwavering attention to the other. Months had passed, and the world felt lighter, as if the weight of whispered rumors and cautious glances had finally lifted. She returned after her leave, not as a teacher tethered to rules and halls of judgment, but as someone who had reclaimed her rhythm, her presence, her voice. I had also shifted, small but meaningful changes in my life: a new apartment, a job that gave me steady purpose, the kind of foundation that made closeness feel safe rather than precarious. We met again one bright morning, the kind where sunlight spilled across the sidewalk in warm, liquid ribbons. The city hummed gently around us, but in that moment, the noise was distant, irrelevant. She was standing near a small cafe, coat open to let the sunlight brush her shoulders, hair catching the light in quiet gleams of gold and chestnut. When she saw me, a smile curved her lips, slow, genuine, grounded in history and anticipation. We sat together at a corner table, the world outside blurring into soft motion. Her fingers reached across the table, brushing a crumb from my lip, a gesture so delicate it could have gone unnoticed if I hadn't leaned in to feel it. My hand followed, thumb pressing gently to the back of her hand, sensing the familiar warmth where the lines of her skin told a story of time, choices, and endurance. That small, shared contact was a reaffirmation: we had navigated storms, faced consequences, and still chosen each other, not recklessly, but consciously. Around us, the cafe smelled of roasted coffee and fresh bread, sunlight spilling across worn wood tables. Birds called faintly from nearby trees, and the distant murmur of conversation created a soothing soundtrack. In that ordinary, simple environment, there was no tension, no judgment, only the quiet music of life resuming its natural rhythm. We spoke of small plans, a weekend trip, rearranging furniture, reading together. Nothing extravagant, nothing forced, just the deliberate, slow building of a life together. Every glance, every smile, every incidental touch carried the weight of shared understanding and respect. I felt the same pull I had months ago, but now it was calm, steady, a warmth rather than a spark. As we walked down the sunlit street later, hands occasionally brushing, shoulders touching, I realized that the rules that had once loomed so large were no longer barriers. They had become part of the story we carried, a story not of rebellion, but of careful choices, honest hearts, and the courage to love fully while keeping each other safe. The rules had once been a line between us. Now they're part of the story we keep telling, not because we broke them recklessly, but because we learned how to love with eyes open. And in that quiet rhythm, the slow burn of months had finally blossomed into a steady, enduring flame, one we could nurture together, hands entwined, hearts aligned, eyes open to the future. If you enjoyed this slow burn love story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a moment of romance, emotion, and heartfelt connection. Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear which part of the story touched you the most.